It was just a portrait of a prisoner, but one hidden detail exposed the secret the Gestapo tried to bury forever. The photograph had been stored in a brown envelope at the French National Archives for 77 years. It arrived in 1945 as part of a box of documents recovered from a Gestapo office in Lyon after the liberation of France. Thousands of photographs, interrogation reports, and administrative records documenting the Nazi occupation. Dr. Thomas Bergeron, a historian specializing in French resistance movements during World War II, pulled the photograph from its archival folder on a grey morning in March 2022. He was working on a project documenting women in the resistance, and a colleague had mentioned that the Lyon Gestapo files contained several unexamined prisoner photographs. The photograph was in surprisingly good condition considering its age. It showed a woman sitting in what appeared to be an interrogation room. She looked to be in her late 30s or early 40s, with dark hair pulled back severely from her face. Her expression was difficult to read, not defiant, not broken, but something else entirely. Something that made Thomas pause. The woman wore a simple dark dress, and her hands were folded in her lap. Behind her the room was sparse, a plain wall, a partially visible door, and what looked like a small window near the ceiling. In the bottom right corner of the photograph, stamped in faded ink, was a date, November 11th, 1942, and a number, 4077. Thomas had seen hundreds of similar photographs. The Gestapo had been meticulous about documenting their prisoners, taking photographs for identification purposes, for their records, for their bureaucratic machine that turned human beings into numbers and files. This photograph seemed entirely routine, but something about the woman's expression held his attention. He was about to file it away when he noticed something odd. The photograph had been taken from a slightly unusual angle, not straight on as was typical for identification photos, but from a position slightly to the left, as if the photographer had deliberately shifted their position. Thomas reached for his magnifying glass, a tool he still preferred despite having access to digital scanning equipment. He examined the photograph inch by inch, looking for anything that might explain the unusual composition. Then he saw it. On the wall behind the woman, partially obscured by shadow, were scratches in the plaster. At first, they looked random, just damage to an old wall. But when Thomas adjusted the angle of his desk lamp, the scratches formed letters, words, a message. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone. Within 3 hours, 2 other historians had joined Thomas in his workspace at the French National Archives. Dr. Marie Dubois, an expert in Gestapo operations in occupied France, stood closest to the photograph, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she studied the wall behind the prisoner. Beside her, Dr. Henri Laurent, who had spent 30 years researching the Holocaust in France, was already taking notes. "Can we be certain these marks are intentional?" Marie asked, her voice careful. "Old plaster can crack and create patterns that look like letters." Thomas shook his head. "Look at the consistency of the depth and width. These were carved deliberately, probably with something small and sharp. A nail, perhaps, or a piece of wire." Henri leaned in closer. "What does it say?" "I can make out some letters, but not all of them." Thomas had already transcribed what he could see. "They said I would live if I talked. I did not talk. Remember Adelaide Moreau? Tell my children I..." And then the message ended, or at least the visible portion did. "Adelaide Moreau," Marie repeated softly. "We need to find out who she was." Henri was already opening his laptop. "The number on the photograph is 4077. That's a Gestapo prisoner registration number. If their records from Lyon survived, we might be able to match it." The 3 historians spent the rest of that day searching through digitized Gestapo records. The Lyon office had been particularly thorough in their documentation, and much of it had been preserved as evidence for war crimes trials. By evening, they found it. Prisoner, 4077, 77, Adelaide Moreau, born April 15th, 1902, in Marseille. Arrested October 23rd, 1942, in Lyon. Charge, suspected member of the resistance. Suspected of harboring British airmen and facilitating escape lines to Spain. And then, in cold bureaucratic notation, executed November 11th, 1942, 6:47 p.m. "The photograph was taken the same day she was executed," Thomas said quietly. "Look at the timestamp. If she was executed at 6:47 p.m. and photographs were typically taken during afternoon interrogation sessions, this photograph was taken hours before they killed her, Marie finished. Maybe even minutes before. Henri had pulled up another document. There's a reference here to a special interrogation conducted on November 11th, led by Klaus Barbie himself. The name hung in the air between them. Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, the Gestapo chief whose brutality had been legendary even among the Nazis. He had been responsible for thousands of deaths, including the deportation of Jewish children and the torture of resistance members. If Barbie personally interrogated her, Marie said, then Adelaide Moreau was someone important, someone they desperately wanted information from. Thomas was studying the photograph again with fresh eyes. Look at her expression. I thought at first she looked blank, emotionless. But now, knowing she carved that message into the wall, knowing she was going to die in a few hours and she knew it, she looks determined, Henri said. She's looking directly at the camera, at the photographer, as if she's trying to tell them something. Or as if she wanted to be remembered, Marie added. She carved her name into that wall. She sat for this photograph, knowing it might be the last image of her that survived. She's bearing witness. Thomas made a decision. We need to find her family. The message says, "Tell my children." She had children. They might still be alive, or their descendants might be. The search for Adelaide Moreau's family proved more difficult than expected. Records from occupied France were incomplete, especially for resistance members whose activities had been conducted in secret. Many families had gone into hiding, or had been scattered by the war. But Marie found a lead in the records of a Catholic church in Marseille. A baptism record from 1925 showed that Adelaide Moreau had married a man named Jean-Pierre Moreau in 1924. The couple had 2 children, a son, Michel, born in 1926, and a daughter, Sophie, born in 1928. They would have been teenagers when their mother was arrested, Marie noted, old enough to remember her clearly. Henri searched through post-war records, looking for any trace of Michel or Sophie Moreau. The task was complicated by the fact that Sophie might have married and changed her name, and both children might have left France after the war. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Thomas had posted an inquiry on a genealogy forum frequented by researchers tracing French resistance families. Within 48 hours, he received a message from a man named David Moreau in Montreal, Canada. My grandmother was Adelaide Moreau, David's message read. She was executed by the Gestapo in Lyon in 1942. My father, Michel Moreau, was her son. He passed away in 2019, but he spoke about his mother often. He never knew exactly what happened to her, only that she had been arrested and killed. The family tried to find information after the war, but the records were chaotic, and many files had been destroyed. Thomas called David immediately. The conversation lasted over an hour. David explained that Michel and Sophie Moreau had been hidden by neighbors when their mother was arrested. Their father, Jean-Pierre, had also been involved in the resistance and had been killed in 1943 during a Gestapo raid. After the war, the children had been raised by an aunt. Michel eventually emigrated to Canada in 1952, trying to escape the memories. Sophie had stayed in France, married, and raised a family in Bordeaux. She had died in 2015. My father carried guilt his entire life, David said, his voice heavy with emotion. He believed his mother had been captured because of him, because he'd been careless somehow. He never knew the details of what she'd done, or why the Gestapo targeted her. All he knew was that one day she was arrested, and he never saw her again. We found a photograph, Thomas said carefully, taken on the day she died, and there's something in it that I think you need to see. Thomas sent digital copies of the photograph and the enhanced images showing Adelaide's message carved into the wall. David called back within an hour, crying. She was thinking of us, he said. In those final hours, she was thinking of her children. She wanted us to know she didn't betray anyone, that she stayed strong. Marie had been researching Adelaide's resistance activities. She found references in British intelligence files that had been declassified in the 1990s. Adelaide Moreau had been part of an escape line that helped Allied airmen shot down over France reach safety in Spain. Between 1940 and 1942, she had helped at least 17 British and American pilots escape. She was crucial to the network. Marie explained when she shared her findings with Thomas and Henry. Her apartment in Lyon was a safe house. She had connections with railway workers who could provide false papers and arrange transport. The Gestapo had been trying to break this particular escape line for months. Henri found an interrogation report that made them all pause. Dated November 11th, 1942, signed by Klaus Barbie himself. Subject 4277, Adelaide Moreau, subjected to enhanced interrogation techniques from 2:00 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. Subject refused to provide names of collaborators or details of escape network operations. Subject maintained silence despite intensive questioning. Recommend immediate execution as example to others. No useful intelligence obtained. Enhanced interrogation techniques, Thomas said bitterly. That's what they called torture. She was tortured for 3.5 hours, Marie added, her voice quiet. And she didn't talk. That's what her message meant. I did not talk. The photograph took on new meaning with this knowledge. Adelaide Moreau, photographed after hours of torture, hours before her execution, had somehow found the strength to carve a message into the wall and then sit for this photograph with her head held high. Thomas decided they needed to understand more about the photographer. Gestapo photographs were typically taken by either German military photographers or by French civilians forced to work for the occupation authorities. He examined the photograph again, this time looking for any identifying marks or signature. On the back of the original print, in faded pencil, was a name. L. Rousseau. Rousseau, Thomas said aloud. That's a French name. Henri pulled up employment records from the Lyon Gestapo headquarters. They had required all civilian employees to register, and those records had been preserved. He found it. Laurent Rousseau, photographer, employed by Gestapo Lyon office from June 1941 to August 1944. Resident of Lyon. Born 1912. He was French, Marie said. Working for the Gestapo. A collaborator. But Thomas wasn't so sure. Look at this photograph again. The angle. The positioning that allows Adelaide's message to be visible. Most Gestapo identification photos were taken straight on, centered, neutral. This one isn't. You think he positioned the shot deliberately? Henry asked. So the message would be captured? I think it's possible, Thomas replied. And I think we need to find out more about Laurent Rousseau. The search for information about Laurent Rousseau led them down a complicated path. After the liberation of France, many collaborators had been prosecuted or had fled. Others had simply disappeared into the chaos of post-war France, trying to forget or hide what they'd done. Thomas found a reference in post-war judicial records. Laurent Rousseau had been arrested in September 1944 and charged with collaboration. But the case had been dropped in 1945 due to insufficient evidence and testimony from former resistance members who claimed Rousseau had secretly helped them. He was working both sides, Marie said when Thomas shared this discovery. Photographing prisoners for the Gestapo by day, but helping the resistance somehow. Henri found testimony from one of the resistance members who had defended Rousseau. A woman named Gabrielle Petit stated that Laurent Rousseau had passed photographs and documents to the resistance, helping them identify which prisoners were being held at Gestapo headquarters and what charges they faced. He was risking his life, Thomas observed. If the Gestapo had discovered he was leaking information, they would have executed him immediately, which means every photograph he took was an act of resistance, Marie added, including this one of Adelaide Moreau. Thomas found a letter in the archives, written by Laurent Rousseau in 1946 to a friend. The letter had been preserved as part of a collection of post-war correspondence donated by the friend's family. The relevant passage read, I am haunted by the faces I photographed. So many people who knew they were going to die, and I could do nothing to save them except document their existence, capture their dignity in those final moments. There was one woman, Adelaide, who carved a message into the wall before I photographed her. She looked at me, and I saw no fear in her eyes, only determination. I made sure her message was visible in the frame. It was the only thing I could do for her. I pray that someday, someone will see that photograph and remember her courage. Thomas sat back in his chair, the letter in his hands. Laurent Rousseau had known. He had deliberately captured Adelaide's message, and then he had lived with that memory for the rest of his life. Finding out what happened in Adelaide's final hours proved crucial to understanding the full story. Henri discovered a German military report filed by the Lyon garrison commander, noting that on November 11, 1942, prisoner 4277 had been executed by firing squad in the courtyard of Montluc prison at 6:47 p.m. The report was coldly bureaucratic, listing the execution as routine disposal of enemy combatant. But Marie found something else. A testimony given during Klaus Barbie's trial in 1987 by a former French prisoner who had been held at Montluc prison in 1942. The witness, Pierre Dubois, described seeing a woman being led to the execution courtyard on November 11, 1942. She walked with her head high, Dubois had testified. She refused the blindfold they offered. When they asked if she had any last words, she said only, "Vive la France." She didn't break, not even at the end. Thomas contacted David Moreau again, with all the information they had gathered. David requested copies of everything. The photograph, the enhanced images showing his grandmother's message, the interrogation reports, Rousseau's letter, and the witness testimony. "My father needed to know this," David said when they spoke again. He spent his whole life thinking his mother might have suffered meaninglessly, that maybe she had given up or broken down. But she didn't. She was a hero. She protected her comrades and died with courage. "There's something else," Thomas said. "Your grandmother's message was incomplete. It ended with, 'Tell my children I,' and then stopped. We think she might have carved more, but that portion of the wall isn't visible in the photograph, or it was damaged later. 'Tell my children I love them,' David said immediately, his voice breaking. That's what she would have wanted to say. 'Tell my children I love them, and that I didn't betray the cause.'" Thomas and his colleagues spent the following weeks pursuing every available lead about Adelaide Moreau and the circumstances surrounding her final photograph. Marie discovered that the room where Adelaide had been photographed was not a typical interrogation room, but rather a holding cell in the basement of the Gestapo headquarters on Avenue Berthelot in Lyon. The building still stood, now converted into a memorial center dedicated to the victims of the Nazi occupation. "We need to go to Lyon," Thomas said. "That wall where Adelaide carved her message might still exist." The three historians made the trip to Lyon on a rainy Tuesday in April 2022. The center of the history of the resistance and deportation occupied the former Gestapo headquarters. The current director, a woman named Catherine Mercier, met them at the entrance. "The building has been extensively renovated," Catherine explained as she led them through the corridors. "But we've preserved several of the basement cells as they were found in 1944. They're part of our permanent exhibition." She took them down a narrow staircase to the basement level. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the air felt heavy with history. The basement consisted of a series of small rooms, each no larger than 10 feet by 8 feet. Some had been converted into exhibition spaces with photographs and explanatory panels. Others remained empty, their walls still bearing the marks of their grim past. "This section held prisoners awaiting interrogation or execution," Catherine said, her voice reverent in the confined space. "We've documented graffiti and messages carved by prisoners in several of the rooms. Names, dates, prayers, messages to loved ones." Thomas showed Catherine the photograph of Adelaide Moreau. "We believe this was taken in one of these rooms. We're trying to identify which one." Catherine studied the photograph carefully, comparing it to the rooms around them. The window placement, the door frame, the dimensions. "I think this might be cell 7. She led them to a room at the end of the corridor. As they entered, Thomas felt his breath catch. The room matched the photograph exactly. The small window near the ceiling, now covered with protective glass. The door frame, still bearing marks where the original door had hung. And the wall. The wall where Adelaide had sat for her photograph was now protected behind a transparent barrier, but it was clearly visible. The plaster was damaged and discolored, marked by decades of neglect before the building's restoration. And there, at approximately shoulder height for someone sitting on the floor, were the scratches Adelaide had carved. But there was more visible now than had appeared in the photograph. "There's more text," Marie whispered, moving closer to the barrier. The photograph only captured part of the message. Thomas pulled out his notebook and began transcribing the complete message, now fully visible. "They said I would live if I talked. I did not talk. Remember Adelaide Moreau. Tell my children I love them more than life. Tell them their father is brave. Tell them France will be free. LR, you are a good man. God forgive you for what they make you do. November 11th, 1942. The final part of the message, the part that hadn't been visible in the photograph, changed everything. LR, Henri said. Laurent Rousseau. She's speaking to the photographer. She knew he was being forced to work for the Gestapo, Marie added. And she forgave him. She called him a good man. Catherine was visibly moved. In all the years I've worked here, I've seen hundreds of messages left by prisoners. But this, the fact that she used her final hours to offer forgiveness to someone she perceived as another victim, while also affirming her own courage and thinking of her children. Thomas was photographing the wall, documenting every detail. This changes the narrative. Adelaide wasn't just defiant. She was compassionate. Even at the end, even after being tortured, she saw Laurent Rousseau's humanity. The discovery of the complete message prompted Thomas to search more intensively for information about Laurent Rousseau's life after the war. He had disappeared from public records after 1946, and Thomas wondered if he had died, or perhaps emigrated. The answer came from an unexpected source. A woman named Claire Rousseau contacted Thomas after seeing a news article about the discovery of Adelaide's complete message. The article had been published in Le Monde and had included photographs of the wall. Laurent Rousseau was my grandfather, Claire wrote in her email. He died in 1998, but before he passed, he left a box of materials with my mother. He told her it should only be opened after his death. Inside were photographs, letters, and a journal. I think you need to see them. Thomas traveled to meet Claire in her apartment in Paris the following week. She was a woman in her 50s, a schoolteacher who had clearly inherited her grandfather's careful attention to detail. The box she showed Thomas contained dozens of photographs, all prisoner portraits from the Lion Gestapo headquarters. He kept copies, Claire explained, against orders, at great risk. He made duplicate prints of every prisoner photograph he took and hid them. After the war, he couldn't destroy them. He said these people deserved to be remembered. Among the photographs was another image of Adelaide Moreau. This one had not been in the official Gestapo files. It showed her from a different angle, and her carved message was even more clearly visible. He took 2 photographs of her, Thomas said. The official one for the Gestapo records, and this one for himself, for memory. But it was Laurent Rousseau's journal that provided the most profound insights. The entries from November 1942 were particularly detailed. November 11th, 1942. Today, I photographed a woman who will haunt me for whatever remains of my life. Her name is Adelaide Moreau, prisoner 4277. She had been tortured by Barbie himself for hours, but when they brought her to be photographed, she walked steadily. Her hands shook slightly, probably from pain, but her eyes were clear. While I was setting up the camera, she asked me my name. I was startled. Prisoners rarely spoke during photographs. I told her. She said, "Laurent, you have a kind face. You don't belong here." I didn't know what to say. Then she asked if she could sit for a moment before the photograph to compose herself. I agreed. That's when she carved the message into the wall. She used a small nail she had somehow kept hidden. I should have stopped her, should have reported it, but I couldn't. I watched her carve her name, her message to her children, and then she looked at me and smiled sadly. "Will you make sure the message is visible in the photograph?" she asked. "So someone will remember?" I positioned the camera to capture it. I took the official photograph for their records. Then I took another, a better angle, showing the message more clearly. This second photograph is mine, my testimony to her courage. She's going to be executed tonight. I know this because Barbie told me so when he ordered the photograph. "One more dead terrorist," he said, laughing. But she's not a terrorist. She's a mother who risked everything to save Allied pilots. She's a hero. Before they took her away, she said to me, "God forgive you for what they make you do." Not "God forgive you for what you do," but for what they make me do. In her final hours, this woman who had been tortured, who was about to die, offered me absolution. I don't deserve it. I am complicit in every death that happens in this building. But I will remember her. And I will make sure others remember too, even if it takes the rest of my life. Thomas read the entry 3 times, tears blurring his vision. Laurent Rousseau had carried Adelaide's forgiveness with him for 56 years, until his death in 1998. Claire showed Thomas more of her grandfather's journal. After the liberation of France, Rousseau had tried to locate Adelaide's children. He had wanted to tell them about their mother's courage, to share her final message. But the chaos of post-war France, with millions of displaced persons and fractured families, had made it impossible. He never found them, Claire said quietly. It was one of his greatest regrets. He died believing he had failed Adelaide Moreau, that he hadn't fulfilled her last wish to tell her children she loved them. But we've found them, Thomas replied. Or rather, we found her grandson. And now we can complete what your grandfather started. Thomas arranged for David Moreau to speak with Claire Rousseau. The conversation between the grandson of Adelaide Moreau and the granddaughter of Laurent Rousseau took place via video call, with Thomas and Marie present as witnesses to this moment of historical reconciliation. David spoke first, his voice thick with emotion. Your grandfather preserved my grandmother's memory. He captured her courage, her love for us, her final message. My father died never knowing these details. But because of what Laurent Rousseau did, I know, and I can tell my children, and they can tell their children. Claire was crying. My grandfather lived with so much guilt. He believed he was a collaborator, that taking those photographs made him complicit in murder. But you're telling me that what he did mattered, that it had meaning. It had tremendous meaning, David replied. He was a witness. In a time when the Nazis tried to erase people, to turn them into numbers and ashes, your grandfather ensured they remained human. He captured their faces, their dignity, their final acts of resistance. That's not collaboration. That's resistance of a different kind. The two families agreed to work together to ensure Adelaide's story, and Laurent's role in preserving it would be told publicly. Thomas and his colleagues prepared a comprehensive exhibition for the Center of the History of the Resistance and Deportation in Lyon. The exhibition opened in November 2022, exactly 80 years after Adelaide Moreau's execution. It featured both photographs of Adelaide, the enhanced images showing her complete wall message, excerpts from Laurent Rousseau's journal, documents about her resistance activities, testimony from the pilots she had helped escape, and photographs of her children, Michelle and Sophie, showing the family she had died protecting. David Moreau traveled from Montreal for the opening, bringing with him a photograph that had been treasured in his family for generations. It showed Adelaide with her two children in 1940, before the occupation, before the resistance, before everything changed. In the photograph, Adelaide was laughing, her arms around her children, all three of them squinting in bright sunlight. This is how I want people to remember her, David said, as the photograph was added to the exhibition. Not just as a victim or a hero, but as a mother, a person who loved and laughed and lived. Claire Rousseau donated her grandfather's box of duplicate photographs to the archives. Among the images were dozens of other prisoners, each one a person whose story had been lost to time. Thomas and Marie began the painstaking work of trying to identify them and locate their families. Laurent Rousseau photographed 237 prisoners between 1941 and 1944, Marie explained during the exhibition opening. Adelaide Moreau is the only one whose identity and full story we've been able to confirm so far. But each of these faces represents a person, a life, a family. And we're committed to finding out who they were. The exhibition drew international attention. Journalists from around the world covered the story of the photograph that had hidden Adelaide's message for 77 years. Holocaust education centers in multiple countries requested traveling versions of the exhibition. The photograph of Adelaide sitting before her, carved message became one of the most widely reproduced images of French resistance history. But the most meaningful responses came from families who recognized faces in Laurent Rousseau's collection of duplicate photographs. A man from Belgium contacted the museum 3 weeks after the opening. "That's my great-uncle," he said, pointing to photograph number 156 in the collection. "He disappeared in 1943. We never knew what happened to him." A woman from Poland identified her grandmother in photograph number 89. She was part of a Jewish family that had fled to France. "We thought everyone in her generation had died without any record." Slowly, painstakingly, Thomas and Marie began connecting faces to names, prisoners to families, lost stories to living descendants. Henri made another significant discovery in early 2023. He found records showing that 17 British and American pilots had filed reports after the war specifically mentioning Adelaide Moreau by name. Each report detailed how she had sheltered them, provided false papers, arranged transport, and risked her life to ensure their escape. One report, filed by RAF pilot James Fletcher in 1945, was particularly detailed. Mrs. Moreau kept me hidden in her apartment for 3 weeks in October 1942. She treated my injuries, fed me from her own rations, and taught me enough French to pass as a deaf-mute worker. She never seemed afraid, though she must have known the consequences if we were discovered. She spoke often of her children, showed me their photographs, told me about their lives. She said she was helping us get home to our families because she understood how precious family was. The last time I saw her, she hugged me and said, "Go home to England. Live a good life. That will be my victory over them." I learned later that she was arrested 2 weeks after I escaped. I've carried guilt about that for my entire life, wondering if my presence led to her capture. Thomas contacted James Fletcher's family. Fletcher had died in 2001, but his son provided contact information for several other pilots who had been part of the escape line. 2 were still alive, both in their late 90s. One of them, John Morrison, made the journey from Virginia to attend a memorial service organized in Adelaide's honor in Lyon in June 2023. Standing before the assembled crowd, including David Moreau and Claire Rousseau, Morrison spoke with a voice that trembled but remained clear. "I was 22 years old when my plane was shot down over France. I thought I would die there, either killed by Germans or starving in hiding. And then I met Adelaide Moreau. She saved my life, not just physically by helping me escape, but spiritually. She showed me that even in the darkest times, there are people who choose courage, who choose compassion, who choose to resist evil at any cost." Morrison paused, wiping his eyes. "I've lived 80 more years because of her. I got to go home, marry, have children and grandchildren. I've had a long, good life. Adelaide Moreau gave me that gift, and it cost her everything. There isn't a day that I don't think about her sacrifice." The city of Lyon announced that a street near the former Gestapo headquarters would be renamed Rue Adelaide Moreau. A plaque was installed on the building where she had lived, noting her resistance activities and her sacrifice. The French government posthumously awarded Adelaide the Médaille de la Résistance and the Légion d'honneur. David Moreau accepted the medals on behalf of his grandmother at a ceremony at the Élysée Palace. But perhaps the most powerful tribute came from an unexpected place. A group of high school students in Lyon, inspired by Adelaide's story, created a documentary project researching other women in the resistance whose stories had been forgotten or overlooked. Their work led to the identification of 17 more women who had been executed at Montluc prison during the occupation, all previously anonymous in the records. So Adelaide's story taught us that history isn't just about the famous battles and leaders, one student explained during a presentation of their research. It's about ordinary people who made extraordinary choices. And it taught us that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance, like carving a message into a wall or taking a photograph at the right angle, can echo through generations. Thomas continued his research, and in late 2023, he made one final significant discovery. In the German Federal Archives in Berlin, he found a report written by Klaus Barbie in December 1942, 1 month after Adelaide's execution. The report complained about difficulties with photographic documentation and noted that the photographer, Laurent Rousseau, had been dismissed from his position for unreliability. Attached to the report was a memo indicating that several prisoner photographs had been found to contain unauthorized elements, including visible messages carved by prisoners. The memo recommended that all future prisoner photographs be taken against blank walls with no furniture or fixtures that could be used to leave messages. "They knew," Thomas said when he shared this finding with Marie and Henri. The Gestapo figured out what Rousseau was doing. They realized he was deliberately capturing the prisoners' messages, their acts of resistance. That's why they fired him. Marie pulled up her research on Rousseau's life. Look at the dates. He was dismissed in December 1942, but he wasn't arrested until September 1944. That's almost 2 years. What was he doing during that time? The answer came from resistance records. After his dismissal from the Gestapo, Laurent Rousseau had gone underground and joined the resistance actively. He had used his knowledge of Gestapo procedures and his photographs to help the resistance identify collaborators and plan operations. Adelaide's death changed him, Henri observed. He went from being a reluctant participant, trying to help where he could while protecting himself, to becoming an active resistor. Her courage, her forgiveness, it transformed him. Claire Rousseau confirmed this when Thomas shared the discovery with her. My grandfather rarely spoke about the war, but when he did, he always mentioned a woman who had forgiven him. He never told us her name, but he said she had shown him what real courage looked like, and that he had spent the rest of the war trying to honor her memory. The photograph of Adelaide Moreau, once just another image in a box of Gestapo records, had become a touchstone for discussions about resistance, courage, forgiveness, and the ways that individual acts of witness and documentation can preserve truth across generations. Thomas often thought about the chain of decisions and chances that had preserved Adelaide's story. If Laurent Rousseau hadn't kept duplicate photographs, if Thomas hadn't noticed the unusual angle of the original image, if the wall in Cell 7 hadn't survived the building's renovations, if David Moreau hadn't seen the genealogy forum post, Adelaide might have remained prisoner number 4227. A statistic rather than a person. On the first anniversary of the exhibition opening, in November 2023, a ceremony was held at the wall where Adelaide had carved her message. The wall had been further preserved and was now the centerpiece of a dedicated memorial room in the center. David Moreau stood before the wall, his children and grandchildren beside him. He read aloud his grandmother's complete message, his voice carrying through the small room. They said I would live if I talked. I did not talk. Remember Adelaide Moreau. Tell my children I love them more than life. Tell them their father is brave. Tell them France will be free. LR, you are a good man. God forgive you for what they make you do. Then David added his own words. Grandmother, we remember you. We tell your story. We honor your courage. France is free, just as you said it would be. And your message of love has reached us. 81 years later. You are not forgotten. You will never be forgotten. The room was silent, except for quiet weeping. In that moment, the distance between 1942 and 2023 collapsed. Adelaide Moreau, who had died alone in a courtyard, was surrounded by people who knew her name, understood her sacrifice, and honored her memory. Thomas stood at the back of the room, watching the ceremony. He thought about all the faces in Laurent Rousseau's photographs, the other prisoners whose names they were still working to identify. Each one had a story, a family, a final moment of courage, or fear, or hope. The work of remembering would continue. More families would be found. More stories would be recovered from the archives. More names would be restored to people who had been reduced to numbers. But Adelaide's story would always be central to this work, because her photograph, her message, and Laurent Rousseau's act of witness had shown that even in humanity's darkest moments, there are people who refuse to let truth be buried. People who carve their names into walls, who position cameras to capture evidence, who preserve documents against orders, who search through archives for forgotten stories. After the ceremony, Claire Rousseau and David Moreau unveiled a new addition to the memorial room, a photograph of Laurent Rousseau, displayed beside the photograph of Adelaide. The caption read, Laurent Rousseau, photographer and witness. Through his camera, he preserved the dignity of the condemned and created evidence that justice, however delayed, would have truth to work with. The two photographs hung side by side. Adelaide Moreau, prisoner 4277, who had refused to talk and had died with courage, and Laurent Rousseau, the reluctant collaborator turned active resistor, who had ensured she would be remembered. Thomas looked at the two faces and thought about the message Adelaide had carved. LR, you are a good man. She had seen Laurent Rousseau's essential humanity in a place designed to strip away all humanity, and he had spent the rest of his life trying to be worthy of her forgiveness. The story of the portrait, taken 2 hours before Adelaide Moreau's death, had become a story about courage, witness, forgiveness, and the long, difficult work of recovering truth from history's shadows. It was a story about how a single photograph, examined with care and persistence 80 years after it was taken, could restore a name, reunite a family across generations, and remind us all that behind every number, every statistic, every victim of atrocity, there is a person who loved and was loved, who made choices, who deserves to be remembered. Adelaide Moreau's reflection, captured in a photograph by a man she forgave, had spoken across 8 decades. And finally, people were listening. Her message had reached her children, just as she had hoped. And through her story, she had reached countless others, teaching them about the costs of resistance, the power of forgiveness, and the enduring importance of bearing witness to truth. The photograph would remain in the memorial, a permanent reminder that some secrets should never stay buried, that courage can take many forms, and that even after 80 years, justice and memory can still find their way home.